Before we begin, let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you right now. I'm curious how many of you are watching this alone, in the dark, perhaps later than you should be. Tonight, we're stepping into territory that was never meant to be mapped. This is not a simple bestiary, not a parade of fictional creatures. This is a guided descent into the core of a literary phenomenon that dared to ask, what if reality itself was never meant for us? We are about to examine every major entity in the Lovecraftian mythos, from the dream-haunted Cthulhu to the whispering deceptions of Nyarlathotep, from the blind idiot god at the center of all chaos to the final presence, one so conceptually corrosive it has been effectively banned from most discussions of the mythos. Not because it is violent, but because it erases the lines we draw between fiction and implication. This won't be a fan tribute. It's an investigation into the monsters that exist, not as villains, but as functions of entropy, of knowledge, of perception collapse. We'll begin with the historical currents that birthed these horrors, follow their thematic logic, dissect their literary appearances, and trace their afterlives in modern culture, conspiracy, and psychology. By the end of this video, you may find that these monsters don't merely exist in books, they live in ideas we cannot unthink. To understand the monsters of Lovecraft, one must first understand the world that made him. Howard Phillips. Lovecraft was born in 1890 in Providence, Rhode Island, a city that, even then, bore the crumbling weight of colonial legacy, crisscrossed by graveyards, decaying mansions, and inherited names. His lineage traced back to early American settlers, but the wealth and prestige that once defined the Lovecraft name had long since faded by the time of his birth. This backdrop of personal decline, set within a nation grappling with modernization, scientific upheaval, and post-war nihilism, formed the psychological substrate of Lovecraft's worldview. His monsters are not born of exuberant fantasy, but of cultural atrophy and metaphysical dread. Lovecraft came of age during a seismic shift in the Western intellectual landscape. The 19th century optimism about progress, buoyed by industry, colonial expansion, and Enlightenment ideals, was crumbling under the weight of new horrors. The First World War, 1914 to 1918, exposed the brutal consequences of unchecked technological advancement. For many, it marked the end of human exceptionalism. Lovecraft never served in the war, but he observed its carnage through the lens of history and correspondence. In his personal letters, he refers to the war as evidence of a universe devoid of inherent morality, only blind forces grinding forward. His monsters, accordingly, do not punish or reward. They exist because the universe permits them to. They are not evil, they are indifferent. This distinction between malevolence and indifference is vital. Traditional Gothic horror thrived on curses, revenge, and human sin. Lovecraft replaced these with cosmic scale and temporal dislocation. Where Mary Shelley gave us a monster stitched from man's hubris, Lovecraft gave us entities that predated humanity by eons and would outlast us without notice. Consider this carefully. The terror in Lovecraft is not that we are prey, but that we are irrelevant. Cthulhu does not hunt us. It dreams, and in dreaming, shatters minds. Azathoth does not rule. It writhes, thoughtless, at the center of all existence. These entities are not evil gods, but anti-gods, concepts beyond intention or morality. This shift in monster logic aligns with the philosophical currents of Lovecraft's era. The rise of existentialism, spurred by thinkers like Søren Kierkegaard and later embraced by Jean-Paul Sartre, interrogated the absence of inherent meaning. Meanwhile, scientific advancements, Einstein's relativity, quantum mechanics, Darwinian evolution, destabilized the old hierarchies of certainty. Time became relative. Species were mutable. The heavens, once divine, became silent voids. Lovecraft absorbed these revelations not as progress, but as horrors. His monsters are metaphors for new knowledge that strips away old comfort. They are avatars of epistemic vertigo. But Lovecraft did not construct a formal mythology. Contrary to later interpretations, he never intended to create a unified Cthulhu Mythos. That term was coined by August Derleth after Lovecraft's death in 1937. Lovecraft himself referred to his recurring pantheon only as Yog-Sothothery, and even that term was used with ironic detachment. He viewed the recurrence of names, books, and places across his stories as a method of forging a simulacrum of ancient authenticity, not a codified belief system. The Necronomicon, for instance, was not meant to be a fantasy relic. It was a narrative device, crafted to resemble the kind of dangerous, half-lost text a real-world scholar might reference. His monsters were similarly constructed, glimpsed, never described in full, always distorting the lens of human perception. Intentional ambiguity was crucial to this structure. In his 1927 essay, Supernatural Horror in Literature, Lovecraft stated, "The oldest and strongest emotion of mankind is fear, and the oldest and strongest kind of fear is fear of the unknown. To name a thing is to contain it." Lovecraft's refusal to define his monsters directly preserves their conceptual power. When he does describe, it is often through contradiction or negation. A face without a face, geometry not of Euclid, a sound that defied all earthly timbre. These are not descriptions, but refusals of description. Linguistic breakdowns designed to induce psychological recoil. It is worth noting that Lovecraft's personal views often mirrored the monstrous ideologies in his fiction. His letters contain explicit racism, xenophobia, and classism, all of which colored his vision of the other. Immigrant communities, scientific change, and modern art all became, in his mind, signs of civilizational decay. His monsters, frequently described as hybrids, degenerates, or biological aberrations, carry the imprint of these biases. Yet to study Lovecraft is not to endorse these views, but to confront how horror has historically encoded cultural anxieties. The monsters are meaningful because they reflect what a particular mind, in a particular moment, found unthinkable. By the time of his death in 1937, Lovecraft had published few stories in major outlets, and most of his readership came from amateur press circles. But his influence metastasized posthumously, especially after August Derleth and Arkham House began collecting and distributing his works. What began as personal dream visions and dread-infused philosophies became a shared language of horror. The monsters, once half-glimpsed on crumbling New England shores, were now echoed in films, games, academic essays, and conspiracies. Their true danger was not their tentacles, but their ideas. Lovecraft's monsters did not emerge in isolation. They are the culmination of older mythic patterns, philosophical anxieties, and literary experiments that predate him by centuries. To trace their lineage is to uncover a continuity of unease that stretches from ancient religion to modern metaphysics. Lovecraft did not invent cosmic horror so much as he stripped earlier traditions of their comforting conclusions. Where older myths explained the unknown, Lovecraft preserved it. Where philosophy once promised coherence, he left only scale and silence. Consider first the ancient world. Pre-Christian cosmologies were populated by beings that were neither moral nor humane. The Greek daemons were not devils, but intermediaries, forces that operated according to laws indifferent to human suffering. Hesiod's primordial entities, such as chaos and Nyx, existed before order itself and were never conquered by it. Similarly, in Mesopotamian myth, the gods of the deep, Tiamat above all, represented not evil, but pre-creation disorder. These entities resemble Lovecraft's outer gods, not in appearance, but in function. They embody forces that precede meaning. This reveals something profound. Cosmic horror is not a modern invention, but a resurfacing of older theological discomforts once suppressed by moralized religion. The Judeo-Christian tradition attempted to domesticate these fears by imposing hierarchy and purpose. Angels fell for reasons. Demons rebelled and were punished. Even Satan retained narrative coherence. Lovecraft dismantled this structure entirely. His entities do not fall, rebel, or scheme for dominance. They persist. Yog-Sothoth does not oppose humanity. It intersects with it. Azathoth does not corrupt creation. It mindlessly generates it. Not a war between good and evil, but the collapse of the framework that made such a distinction possible. In this sense, Lovecraftian monsters resemble Gnostic archons, cosmic rulers who govern reality without regard for human salvation, operating through systems too vast to confront directly. Philosophically, Lovecraft was drawing from a growing skepticism toward human-centered meaning. Arthur Schopenhauer's pessimism, published in the early 19th century, framed existence as an expression of blind will rather than divine intention. Friedrich Nietzsche later announced the death of God, destabilizing moral absolutes and metaphysical purpose. Lovecraft absorbed these ideas intuitively rather than academically. He did not quote Nietzsche, but he dramatized Nietzsche's implications. A universe without inherent value does not merely lack meaning, it actively resists interpretation. Lovecraft's monsters inhabit that resistance. They are what meaning collapses into when stripped of narrative consolation. At the same time, 19th century science was producing its own philosophical shocks. Charles Darwin's On the Origin of Species, 1859, repositioned humanity as a contingent outcome of natural processes rather than a designed endpoint. Geological discoveries revealed deep time, epochs so vast that human history became negligible by comparison. Astronomy expanded the known universe beyond any theological frame. Lovecraft internalized these developments and converted them into horror. His monsters often predate humanity by millions of years, sleep beneath geological layers, or originate from alien stars. The fear is not invasion, but displacement. Humanity is revealed as temporary, accidental, and unremarkable. Literary antecedents sharpen this transformation. Edgar Allan Poe provided Lovecraft with a model for psychological destabilization, particularly through unreliable narrators and obsessive perception. Yet Poe's horror remained intimate, rooted in guilt and internal decay. Algernon, Blackwood, and Arthur Machen extended horror outward, introducing ancient survivals and non-human consciousness lurking beneath modernity. Machen's The Great God Pan is especially instructive. It presents knowledge itself as corrosive, capable of destroying sanity by revealing forbidden continuity between humanity and something older. Lovecraft acknowledged Machen explicitly, adapting this premise while removing its residual mysticism. Where Machen implied secret gods, Lovecraft implied no gods at all, only structures beyond comprehension. Lord Dunsany's influence is subtler but equally important. His dreamlike pantheons and invented mythologies demonstrated how fictional gods could feel ancient without being systematic. Lovecraft learned from Dunsany how to evoke antiquity through tone rather than exposition. This technique allowed Lovecraft to construct monsters that feel remembered rather than introduced. Names recur, books are cited, ruins imply civilizations without explanation. The result is a literary archaeology that suggests depth without providing maps. We must pause here to note what Lovecraft rejected as much as what he absorbed. He avoided allegory, moral instruction, and psychological catharsis. His monsters do not represent repressed desires or ethical failures. They are not symbols waiting to be decoded. They are systems that overwrite the decoding process itself. This is not horror as metaphor, but horror as epistemological disruption. Knowledge does not enlighten, it destabilizes. These cultural and philosophical antecedents converge on a single premise, that human understanding is fragile, local, and temporary. Lovecraft's originality lies in refusing to repair that fragility. He inherits ancient chaos, modern skepticism, and scientific displacement, and then declines to resolve them. His monsters persist where explanation fails. Language, for Lovecraft, was never just a medium of storytelling. It was a boundary, a porous membrane between sanity and collapse, between the known and the unknowable. His monsters do not simply appear, they rupture syntax, mutilate phonetics, and disassemble semantic order. Their names do not signify, they interfere. This is not linguistic ornamentation, it is philosophical engineering. Lovecraft's use of language is a direct assault on the Enlightenment assumption that to name a thing is to know it. Begin with the names themselves: Cthulhu, Yog-Sothoth, Nyarlathotep, Shub-Niggurath, Azathoth. These are not drawn from classical mythology, nor do they conform to any consistent linguistic origin. Instead, they evoke a phonological dissonance, a mingling of consonantal clusters and guttural rhythms designed to produce discomfort when spoken aloud. Lovecraft claimed that the correct pronunciation of Cthulhu could not be rendered in human speech, offering instead approximations like Cthulhu. But even this is a gesture, not a rule. The name's primary function is disruption. It marks a site where human phonetics fail. This strategic failure mirrors his monster's metaphysical function. If Cthulhu cannot be spoken, then Cthulhu cannot be contained by thought. The unspeakable becomes literal. This technique builds on a long tradition of linguistic taboo. In Jewish mysticism, the tetragrammaton, YHWH, was considered unutterable, its absence from the vocal register reinforcing divine mystery. Lovecraft inverts this principle. His monsters are not sacred, but alien. Their names deny familiarity. Where sacred silence invokes reverence, Lovecraftian silence signals epistemic breach. Yet these names are not arbitrary. They follow internal logics that suggest structure without revealing it. Many of Lovecraft's invented words contain repeated phonemes: Shub-Niggurath, Tsathoggua, Relie. These patterns hint at a latent grammar, as if the mythos speaks a language just out of reach. Several stories, such as the Dunwich Horror and the Call of Cthulhu, reference chants, incantations, and sigils that function as both invocation and infection. Fanglui magulwinaf Cthulhu relie wagahnagulftagn. This is not translation, it is transmission. The phrase mimics syntactic structure while resisting comprehension, suggesting that speech itself can summon or distort reality. This raises a disturbing implication, that language is not merely descriptive, but generative. In Lovecraft's fiction, To read is to participate. Characters do not merely learn, they become exposed. Books like the Necronomicon do not reveal truths, they implant them. The act of reading initiates transformation, often through language the reader cannot fully understand. This mimics the function of magical grimoires in occult traditions, but removes any promise of power or control. Knowledge is not mastery, it is exposure. The symbolic architecture of Lovecraft's stories reinforces this collapse of linguistic security. Consider the frequent references to non-Euclidean geometry, cyclopean masonry, or angles that should not exist. These are spatial metaphors, but they double as semiotic breakdowns. Just as physical space distorts, so too does meaning. Description becomes contradiction, a door that was not a door, a color out of space, architecture that hurt the eyes. Language, which once promised illumination, becomes treacherous. It deceives. It breaks. We must pause here. In Lovecraft, there is no safe observer position. Even the narrator, traditionally the rational anchor of Gothic horror, is destabilized by language. Their attempts to describe the indescribable lead not to revelation, but to self-destruction. Syntax phrase. Paragraphs become fragmented. Madness does not arrive through plot. It arrives through grammar. This technique anticipates post-structuralist critiques of language itself, that words do not point to stable realities, but circulate within systems of difference and deferral. Lovecraft intuited this decades before Derrida. There are, of course, countercurrents. August Derleth attempted to systematize the mythos posthumously, classifying the beings into elemental categories and constructing a moral cosmology around them. In Derleth's schema, Lovecraft's gods became demons, and their names became demonic signifiers, symbols of evil rather than of collapse. But this move misunderstands the original design. Lovecraft's language is not code for hidden truths. It is evidence of their erasure. His monsters do not symbolize. They unsymbolize. Their names are not puzzles to be solved, but scratches on the surface of intelligibility. Symbolic language extends beyond names and into visual and spatial motifs. The city of R'lyeh, for instance, is not simply submerged. It is structured in impossible geometries. Its angles were wrong. Its architecture induces vertigo. Its layout rejects orientation. This is symbolic only in the most literal sense. R'lyeh is a glyph made flesh, a sigil so massive it manifests as a city. The monster within it, Cthulhu, is not the threat. The place is. Lovecraft's monsters are often indistinguishable from their environment, suggesting that reality itself can become a sign of its own undoing. Finally, consider the books. The Necronomicon, Kult de Ghoul, Unaussprechlichen Kulten. These texts function as conduits, not containers. They are never quoted at length, rarely translated fully, and often exist in fragments or paraphrase. This mirrors real-world occult texts like the Picatrix or Zohar, where partial access generates both fascination and danger. Lovecraft weaponizes this ambiguity. The power of the book lies not in what it reveals, but in what it suggests remains unread. Lovecraft's monsters endure not because they are visible, but because they feel remembered. His genius was not merely invention. It was fabrication of authenticity. His narratives evoke the uncanny sense that we are encountering fragments of a history too ancient to be fiction, too cohesive to be coincidence. This sense of mythic weight, achieved without formal myth, is the cornerstone of his horror. The monsters are frightening not because they attack, but because they belong, as if the universe had always held them, and only now are we realizing it. The illusion of myth in Lovecraft's work is constructed through methodical narrative devices, not detailed world-building. Unlike Tolkien's linguistic genealogies or Campbell's mythic archetypes, Lovecraft's mythos operates in fragments. His universe is not built, it is unearthed. Stories rarely begin with the creature itself. Instead, they open with ruins, diaries, unearthed texts, or half-deciphered accounts. What we learn of the monster comes in pieces: a professor's journal, a cultist's chant, a newspaper clipping. This documentary layering creates the impression of depth without full exposition. Readers become investigators, not of plot, but of implication. Consider the Call of Cthulhu. The titular monster does not appear until late in the story, and even then, only partially. The narrative is built from layered testimonies: a sculptor's dream-inspired creation, an inspector's journal, a sailor's account. Each source contradicts, overlaps, or omits, forming a mosaic of incomplete data. This mimics the way real myths and historical traumas surface: fragmented, disputed, and uneasily preserved. Cthulhu's terror emerges not from action, but from accumulation. The reader is left with the impression that something immense happened, even if no single narrator can fully explain it. This method is not accidental. Lovecraft was obsessed with the mechanisms of scholarly inquiry. Many of his protagonists are antiquarians, professors, genealogists, or historians. Their descent into horror mirrors their pursuit of knowledge. Footnotes, dates, bibliographies, these are not just stylistic flourishes. They are tools of illusion. They simulate the authority of academic discourse, lending fictional events a tone of plausibility. When a narrator references the Necronomicon and attributes it to the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred, the precision of citation masks the absurdity of content. It is not truth, but structure that convinces. Key to this strategy is Lovecraft's use of invented texts. The Necronomicon, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, and Kult de Ghoul are not simply props. They function as shared nodes across multiple stories, creating the impression of a broader mythos that extends beyond any one narrative. These books are never quoted at length, only referenced, alluded to, or partially translated. Their power lies in their elusiveness. This technique resembles the use of apocryphal texts in real-world religious traditions, where partial revelations sustain both authority and mystery. The Necronomicon feels real not because of what it says, but because of how it behaves: censored, fragmented, replicated, mistranslated. This scaffolding extends to geography. Places like Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich, and Kingsport recur across stories, each with its own haunted history. These towns function like mythic centers, Lovecraft's version of Rome or Delphi. But their borders are porous, their timelines inconsistent. They contain ruins no one can explain, customs no one will admit, and lineages no one will trace. They are not settings so much as excavation sites, where the past continually erupts into the present. By returning to these places across multiple tales, Lovecraft achieves what myth achieves: resonance without repetition. We must pause here and address the crucial role of suggestion. Lovecraft understood that what is hinted at carries more dread than what is defined. His monsters are rarely described in full. Even when they appear, as in the Dunwich Horror or the Whisperer in Darkness, they are partially veiled, seen only in fog, reflected in dreams, or heard through distorted voices. This is not restraint for its own sake. It is a technique of deferred recognition. By refusing to fix the monster in clear terms, Lovecraft forces the reader to internalize the horror. The unknown becomes personal, subjective, inescapable. Narrative authenticity also depends on the inversion of traditional mythic structures. In most mythologies, gods or monsters are named, their origins traced, their powers catalogued. Lovecraft denies this comfort. His entities have no fixed origin, no moral alignment, no purpose. Even their names, Cthulhu, Azathoth, Nyarlathotep, are often presented as approximations, not translations. The reader is told explicitly these are not their real names. This introduces a disturbing contradiction. We know of them, yet we do not know them. Myth without access, story without center. This resistance to total knowledge is part of what makes Lovecraft's mythos feel so ancient. True myth, as preserved in oral traditions and sacred texts, often contains gaps, contradictions, and mysteries. Lovecraft recreates this structure artificially. He implies that his monsters were once worshipped, once remembered, and are now forgotten. Or worse, misremembered. Cults linger, ruins persist, dreams echo. The myth survives not as doctrine, but as interruption. It haunts the edges of recorded history. Finally, consider how this narrative authenticity feeds back into the cultural function of the monsters themselves. They are not just characters, they are symptoms of a world where meaning has eroded, where truth is buried beneath layers of distortion. Lovecraft's method mimics the way real cultures reconstruct their pasts through artifact, rumor, and desperate interpretation. His monsters are powerful, not because they threaten the body, but because they destabilize the archive. Lovecraftian horror is not built on jump scares or visceral monstrosities. It is constructed from conceptual collapse. At its core lies a confrontation not with creatures, but with ideas. Ideas that corrode the structures of self, society, and cosmos. To understand Lovecraft's monsters, we must first understand the philosophical foundations they destabilize. Three concepts dominate the architecture of his mythos: cosmic insignificance, entropic disintegration, and the instability of reality itself. These are not merely themes, they are functions embedded into the very logic of his universe. Let us begin with insignificance, the most foundational principle in Lovecraft's fiction. It is not simply that humans are small, it is that humanity does not matter. In stories like The Whisperer in Darkness and The Shadow Out of Time, the protagonists do not merely encounter beings more advanced than themselves, they discover they are irrelevant to the wider architecture of time and space. Humanity is a temporary biological experiment, observed, manipulated, and ultimately discarded by entities who neither love nor hate us. The horror lies in the revelation that meaning itself is not guaranteed by consciousness, history, or culture. We exist, but so do others, whose gaze does not include us. This philosophical stance mirrors the shift from a geocentric to a cosmocentric worldview. Post-Copernican astronomy had already displaced Earth from the center of the universe. Lovecraft radicalized this displacement by removing the observer from significance entirely. The universe in his fiction is not simply vast, it is indifferent. Entities like Azathoth and Yog-Sothoth do not embody evil. They are not malign forces, they are unaware. Azathoth, the blind idiot god, does not seek to destroy. It writhes at the center of all creation, mindless, surrounded by demonic flutes. Its horror is not an action, but an absence. An engine without a driver. A god that never noticed us to begin with. From this follows entropy, the second major concept. Where insignificance strips away the illusion of importance, entropy erodes the illusion of permanence. In Lovecraft's universe, all things decay. Minds, cities, species, realities. Consider at the Mountains of Madness, in which the ancient alien race of the Elder Things built civilizations millions of years before humans appeared. Their decline is not caused by hubris or punishment. It is the natural function of time. Evolution does not ascend. It corrodes. Civilizations collapse, knowledge is lost, and even the most advanced beings succumb to forces older than themselves. The implication is chilling. Entropy applies not only to matter, but to meaning. This worldview echoes the thermodynamic understanding of entropy in physics, where systems naturally move toward disorder. Lovecraft internalized this model and applied it metaphorically. In his stories, history is not a progression, but a cycle of rise and ruin. Cultures uncover knowledge that destabilizes them. Discoveries lead not to enlightenment, but to disillusionment. The act of knowing is a vector of decay. This is epistemological entropy. The more we understand, the more fragile our understanding becomes. The third foundational concept is the instability of reality itself, most often expressed through dreams, memory distortion, and time collapse. Lovecraft did not treat reality as fixed. In works like The Dream Quest of Unknown Kadath and The Shadow Out of Time, the line between waking and dreaming is not just blurred. It is annihilated. Characters awaken in unfamiliar bodies, occupy memories not their own, or travel vast cosmic distances through altered states. This is not surrealism. It is ontological sabotage. If the mind cannot trust its own continuity, what remains? Lovecraft's dreamlands are not whimsical escapes. They are layered dimensions of encounter, where ancient truths bleed into the waking world. These dream realms reflect a metaphysics inherited partly from Lord Dunsany and partly from occult traditions, but Lovecraft removes any teleology or spiritual redemption. Dreams are not symbolic. They are invasive. They are mechanisms by which the universe leaks into consciousness. In The Call of Cthulhu, artists and sensitives worldwide dream of the same shape, the same city, the same chant. These are not coincidences. They are broadcasts. The unconscious is not internal. It is shared, and it is penetrated. We must pause here. These three principles, insignificance, entropy, and dream reality, are not discrete themes. They interlock. A universe that does not care about us will not preserve us. A mind unmoored from time cannot preserve itself, and knowledge, once unbounded, leads not to mastery, but to collapse. The monsters of Lovecraft do not invade. They emerge as symptoms of a world where categories no longer hold. Their horror is cumulative, conceptual, and often retrospective. We understand too late that something has always been wrong. This conceptual scaffolding positions Lovecraftian horror as a confrontation with existential instability. It is not the threat of death that haunts his stories, but the threat that death is not an event, only a shift in perspective. The characters who suffer most are those who sought truth, professors, archaeologists, linguists. Their reward is disintegration. Madness is not a breakdown, it is a realignment with a more terrifying reality. In Lovecraftian horror, monsters do not operate within the familiar logic of antagonism. They do not seek conquest, revenge, or domination. They do not even recognize humanity as significant. Instead, each entity represents a function, a metaphysical principle or existential disruption personified into presence. To engage with these beings is not to face a threat, but to encounter the breakdown of frameworks, time, causality, consciousness, self. This is why Lovecraft's creatures are so difficult to describe. They are not monsters in the Gothic or folkloric tradition. They are conceptual ruptures, living anomalies within the fabric of reality. Let us begin with the most iconic, Cthulhu. First introduced in The Call of Cthulhu, 1928. Cthulhu is not the most powerful entity in the mythos, nor the oldest, but it is the most symbolically accessible. Cthulhu lies dead but dreaming in the sunken city of R'lyeh, waiting for the stars to align. Its physical form, a grotesque combination of octopus, dragon, and humanoid, is only partially described, and always with an emphasis on psychic trauma. Witnessing Cthulhu induces madness, not because it is malevolent, but because it is. Its presence invalidates the reality of the viewer. Cthulhu is not a god of destruction, but of revelation. Its function is to awaken latent truths, that the world is older, stranger, and more indifferent than we can endure. It embodies repressed memory, a species-level forgetting that threatens to return. Contrast this with Nyarlathotep, the so-called crawling chaos. Unlike most Lovecraftian entities, Nyarlathotep is active, present, and involved. It walks the earth in 1,000 disguises. It speaks, it deceives, it performs, but its deception is not malicious, it is structural. Nyarlathotep is the interface between the incomprehensible and the human mind. It does not destroy, it seduces understanding, only to reveal that comprehension itself is a trap. In this way, Nyarlathotep functions as misinformation incarnate. It destabilizes not by force, but by offering interpretations that cannot survive the encounter with truth. Some scholars have likened it to the trickster gods of African and native traditions, but Nyarlathotep has no interest in moral ambiguity or human affairs. Its role is narrative sabotage. Then there is Azathoth, the blind idiot god, who bubbles and blasphemes at the center of all infinity. It is not evil. It is not conscious. It is not even aware. Azathoth represents a more terrifying concept. Cosmic process without purpose. At the heart of all existence is not order, but random chaos. The mythos suggests that all of creation is the byproduct of Azathoth's mindless, eternal dreaming. This turns the idea of divine authorship inside out. In Abrahamic traditions, God creates with intention. In Lovecraft's cosmology, the creator is accidental. Azathoth is the entropy engine, not a destroyer, but the indifferent origin of all things. Its court of mindless dancers and demonic flutes evokes not grandeur, but absurdity. Yog-Sothoth, by contrast, is a being of total knowledge. It is the gate, the key, and the guardian of the gate. It exists outside time, yet touches all points within it. Yog-Sothoth is often interpreted as a metaphor for higher dimensional consciousness, awareness unbound by linear time. But this knowledge is alienating, not enlightening. In the Dunwich Horror, the half-human spawn of Yog-Sothoth is invisible to normal perception, suggesting a being that exceeds spatial logic. Yog-Sothoth does not choose what to reveal. To invoke it is to confront total exposure, all realities, all selves, all outcomes, and to know everything is to lose all narrative. In this way, Yog-Sothoth functions as omniscience turned inward, folding perception until nothing can be made coherent. Shub-Niggurath, the black goat of the woods with 1,000 young, introduces a biological horror. Frequently associated with fertility cults and chaotic reproduction, this entity symbolizes generative excess. In a universe where life is often treated as miraculous, Shub-Niggurath presents it as malignant, fecundity without control, growth without design. It is invoked in forests through ritual, often in forms that blur the line between organism and swarm. where Nyarlathotep subverts narrative structure, Shub-Niggurath overwhelms biological boundaries. It is not evil. It is the unstoppable logic of life when divorced from context or compassion. Dagon and Hydra, though lesser entities in cosmic scale, embody the theme of evolutionary reversal. In Dagon, 1917, and The Shadow over Innsmouth, 1936, sea-dwelling beings interbreed with humans, producing hybrid offspring that retain ancient traits. These stories are often misread as simple xenophobic metaphors, but their deeper function is to collapse temporal hierarchies. Dagon does not merely threaten humanity, it reminds us that we emerged from the sea and may return to it. Evolution is not upward, it is cyclical. These beings inhabit the memory of water, where past and future fold together in amphibian rituals. Another entity, Tsathoggua, introduces a different principle, dormancy. This slothful, toad-like god, created by Clark Ashton Smith and adopted into Lovecraft's mythos, resides in underground caverns, dreaming in silence. Unlike Cthulhu's tension or Nyarlathotep's motion, Tsathoggua is marked by stagnation. Its presence indicates not danger, but inertia. Yet that very passivity becomes a threat. Cultures around it become decadent, minds dull, ambitions rot. Tsathoggua is the gravity of entropy, pulling all things toward psychic dormancy. Each of these entities disrupts a particular assumption, that gods are moral, that time is linear, that life is sacred, that knowledge is redemptive. Lovecraft's monsters do not violate reality, they reveal it. Their horror is not in what they do, but in what they are. They destabilize the frameworks we rely on to define self, purpose, and meaning. We must be cautious not to treat these beings as a pantheon in the traditional sense. They are not a hierarchy. They do not fight or conspire. Their relationships are implied, never mapped. This refusal of system is intentional. Lovecraft's mythos resists coherence because coherence itself is the illusion under attack. These entities persist across stories not as characters, but as ruptures, each one marking a point where narrative and ontology break down. In the world of Lovecraft, humans do not fight monsters. They encounter them. And that encounter is not a contest of will or strength, but a test of conceptual integrity. To see, to hear, to understand even a fragment of what these entities represent is to risk collapse. Madness in this universe is not a pathology. It is the appropriate response to an impossible reality. Sanity, by contrast, is a kind of useful delusion, a thin film stretched across the eyes to shield the mind from truths that cannot coexist with identity. Human interaction with the Lovecraftian entity occurs almost exclusively through indirect contact, dreams, texts, artifacts, bloodlines. Rarely do characters confront a monster in the flesh. They confront its effects, its echoes, its ontological footprint in the shadow. Out of time, a man becomes aware that his memories have been overwritten by a non-human intelligence. In the dreams in the witch house, the boundary between dream and waking life collapses as a student finds himself involuntarily participating in rituals he cannot remember. And in the Call of Cthulhu, artists and empaths worldwide are plagued by synchronous nightmares as an ancient being stirs in its slumber. These stories share a common structure, the human subject as vulnerable medium, not heroic agent. This vulnerability stems from a central Lovecraftian principle. The mind is not built to comprehend the real universe. What we call reason is not a beacon, but a barricade. The moment one steps beyond its perimeter, through forbidden research, exposure to ancient texts, or proximity to the alien, the mind begins to deteriorate. This is not psychological breakdown in the Freudian sense. There is no buried trauma, no unconscious guilt. The damage is structural. To learn the true nature of reality is to overwrite the cognitive firmware, to install an operating system incompatible with the hardware. Consider the case of Professor Armitage in the Dunwich Horror. As a scholar of the arcane, he successfully thwarts a transdimensional birth, yet even he is shaken by what he has read in the Necronomicon. His language becomes hesitant, his statements laced with ellipses and disclaimers. He never claims full understanding, only strategic ignorance. He survives not because he masters the horror, but because he recognizes the necessity of partial comprehension. This narrative structure recurs throughout the mythos. Characters who know too much rarely survive. If they do, they are shattered, insane, suicidal, exiled. Those who endure the encounter are those who turn away. In this regard, madness becomes the narrative endpoint, not a deviation. The traditional arc of character growth, curiosity, conflict, resolution, is aborted. Instead, the arc becomes exposure, distortion, collapse. In The Rats in the Walls, a man discovers his ancestral connection to subterranean cannibal cults and descends into primal insanity. In The Thing on the Doorstep, identity itself becomes transferable and corruptible as a man's body is occupied by an alien consciousness. In both cases, madness is not failure. It is completion, the terminal state of narrative infected by the real. We must pause here and reflect on the contagion model of knowledge in Lovecraft. Forbidden books, ancient ruins, familial legacies, they all serve as vectors. Madness is transmissible, not through virus or bacteria, but through information. This aligns disturbingly well with real-world analogs, religious revelation, ideological extremism, conspiracy theory. The mind becomes unstable not through force, but through pattern recognition. In Lovecraft, the moment one begins to connect the dots, to see the larger shape beneath the world's surface, is the moment one begins to unravel. This pattern has deep implications. It suggests that the human subject is not stable, not immune, not sovereign. The self is porous. It can be penetrated, rewritten, erased. This is why Lovecraft's protagonists are often scholars, scientists, and rationalists, not because they are strong, but because they trust knowledge, and that trust becomes their undoing. The pursuit of truth does not lead to mastery. It leads to annihilation, not physical, but epistemic. One no longer knows who or what they are. This fragility extends to memory and identity. In The Shadow Out of Time, Nathaniel Peaslee discovers that his body was inhabited by an alien mind for 5 years. His own memories during that period are missing, replaced by dreams of non-Euclidean libraries and cyclopean cities. When he begins to recover those lost years, he does not become whole, he becomes hollow. The knowledge he regains displaces him. He no longer fits into his own life. Memory, in Lovecraft's fiction, is not healing, it is corrosive. Another recurring dynamic is that of the inherited curse. Some characters are not exposed through research, but through lineage. In The Shadow over Innsmouth, the protagonist learns he is descended from deep ones, and by the story's end, embraces his transformation. The horror here is twofold. Not only is one's identity a lie, but one's future is already determined. The monster is not at the gate. It is in the blood. There is no defense against this, only awakening. We must also address the gendered and racial implications of Lovecraft's madness motifs. Often, hybridity is framed as a source of horror, mixed bloodlines, degenerate cults, non-Western rituals. While these elements clearly reflect Lovecraft's personal xenophobia, they also function within a broader metaphysical framework. The monstrous is always that which violates boundaries, between species, between minds, between times. Madness is not solely internal collapse, but the erosion of borders. The horror is not simply that the other exists, but that it has always been part of us. Ultimately, madness in Lovecraft is the moment the human subject recognizes its irrelevance. The moment one realizes, the mind was never meant to carry this much weight. In this universe, the most dangerous act is not murder or ritual. It is understanding. The monster does not come from outside. It emerges from the new logic that replaces the old. In Lovecraft's universe, knowledge is not enlightenment. It is infection. The moment one begins to truly understand is the moment one's mind begins to unravel. This inversion of the classical quest for truth lies at the heart of cosmic horror. The ancient texts, forgotten rituals, and buried truths scattered throughout his stories do not reveal heroic secrets. They dismantle the very frameworks of perception, language, and self. What emerges is not clarity, but collapse. The archetypal object of this collapse is, of course, the Necronomicon. Supposedly authored by the mad Arab Abdul al-Hazred around 700 CE, the book is referenced across multiple stories, rarely quoted directly, never fully described. It is not a codex of arcane spells, nor a mystical key to power. Rather, it is a mimetic hazard, a literary virus. To read it is to become destabilized, not through belief, but through exposure. The text does not require your faith. It simply requires your eyes. As Lovecraft writes in the Dunwich Horror, no reader has ever perused all the contents and survived. The implication is chilling. The book is not passively dangerous. It is active. This reverses the traditional arc of textual power in Western literature. In sacred traditions, texts are protective. They codify belief, provide moral guidance, preserve history. In Lovecraft, texts are corrosive archives, relics of civilizations that should not have existed, authored by minds unfit for narrative structure. The Necronomicon and its companions, Unaussprechlichen Kulten, Kult de Ghoul, de Vermis Mysteries, are not repositories of truth. They are artifacts of collapse, texts that survived their authors and outlived their context, continuing to destabilize those who encounter them. This destabilization is not just thematic, it is structural. Lovecraft rarely reveals the contents of these books. He offers fragments, partial translations, vague references. This preserves the mystique of the text while simulating its effect. A mind encountering something that cannot be fully read. We do not study the Necronomicon. We witness its footprint. We see the scholars it drives mad, the rituals it enables, the suicides it precedes. In this way, the book behaves more like a gravitational force than an object. It exerts pull, and what it draws in, it deforms. We must pause here and consider the epistemological implications. In Lovecraft's world, knowledge is not neutral. It is not a tool to be wielded. It is an active force with ontology-shifting consequences. This aligns with real-world concerns in philosophy of science, particularly the early 20th century crisis in physics and mathematics. Gödel's incompleteness theorems, 1931, Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, 1927, and the rise of quantum mechanics all revealed unsettling truths, that systems of knowledge have limits, that observation affects outcome, that certainty is not attainable. Lovecraft intuited this. His monsters are not unknown, they are unknowable. The horror is not ignorance. The horror is that you cannot know without ceasing to be what you were. This concept is clearest in The Shadow Out of Time, where the protagonist experiences a fugue state during which his consciousness is swapped with that of a member of the great race of Yith, an ancient, time-traveling species that archives knowledge across millennia by hijacking minds. When he begins to recover these memories, he does not gain power. He loses anchorage. The more he remembers, the less he belongs to the human present. Memory, usually framed as a path to healing, becomes a disintegration vector. Knowledge is not redemptive. It is exiling. Similarly, in The Whisperer in Darkness, a folklorist receives correspondence from a man claiming to have encountered alien beings in the Vermont hills. As letters accumulate, so does unease. The protagonist becomes entangled in a lattice of half-truths, each one destabilizing his prior assumptions. The climactic realization is not merely that the aliens exist. It is that language has already been compromised. The man he thought he was writing to may no longer be human. The voice he heard may not be alive. What he thought was information was already an interface. In this model, knowledge is not linear. It is recursive and parasitic. This returns us to the idea of epistemic collapse, the moment when the process of knowing reveals not more reality, but less self. The boundaries of perception erode. The subject becomes unstable. The horror is not that monsters exist, it's that they were never separate from cognition. The monstrous is not just outside, it is within the process of inquiry itself. Consider also how Lovecraft dramatizes this collapse through structure. His stories are often framed as journals, posthumous reports, or confessions, retrospective testimonies of individuals who did not survive the encounter with knowledge. Their words are fragmented, riddled with disclaimers, evasions, and contradictions. The narrative form itself begins to stutter. What we read is not a story, but a trace, a footprint in the ash of someone's mind. This technique mirrors the content. Just as the protagonist cannot contain the truth, the story cannot contain the protagonist. The medium fractures under pressure. Importantly, forbidden knowledge is not merely a plot device. It is the engine of mythic continuity. The same names, books, and phrases recur across different stories, implying a deeper structure without ever codifying it. We hear of the same cities, R'lyeh, Leng, Ultar, the same texts, the same chants, but never in full. This repetition builds the illusion of coherence while withholding access. It mimics real-world mystery traditions, where partial knowledge is designed to preserve awe, danger, and distance. Lovecraft's mythos never offers the whole picture, because the whole picture is what destroys you. In this cosmology, there is no safety in inquiry. The librarian is as vulnerable as the explorer. The act of looking is itself a gamble. What begins as curiosity becomes metamorphosis. The humanist ideal, that knowledge elevates, is inverted. Here, to know is to drown. Lovecraft's mythos was not born whole. It emerged piecemeal, evolving from early stories that contained only a trace of the cosmic, gradually coalescing into a loose lattice of recurring places, names, and insinuations. There is no definitive first appearance of the mythos as a system because Lovecraft never intended to create one. What he built instead was resonance, the echo of deeper truths across stories that refused full revelation. This intertextual layering forms the literary skeleton of Lovecraftian horror, not a universe governed by narrative rules, but a field of implications. The seeds were planted as early as 1917 in Dagon, one of Lovecraft's first published stories. Here we see the outline of a key narrative template, an isolated protagonist contact with something ancient, and the irreversible psychological fallout. The creature in Dagon, a vast amphibious humanoid worshipped by an underwater race, is unnamed by its narrator, but retroactively tied to the titular Philistine god. This fusion of ancient mythology and evolutionary horror would become a central motif. What matters is not the monster's taxonomy, but its temporal displacement. It has been here longer than us, and it is still watching. From this foundation, Lovecraft's fictional world begins to self-reference. In The Nameless City, 1921, the narrator explores ancient ruins in the Arabian desert and uncovers signs of a pre-human reptilian race. The city predates recorded history, and the beings that once inhabited it are only partially dead, half dreaming, half lurking. The story introduces not only themes of architectural vertigo and racial antiquity, but a device that becomes central to the mythos: textual recursion. In the final paragraph, Lovecraft quotes the Necronomicon, marking its first appearance. The line, "That is not dead which can eternal lie, and with strange aeons even death may die," would become a refrain across multiple stories, invoked like a buried spell. This use of internal quotation marks a turning point. Lovecraft was now writing fiction that behaves like scholarship. His characters cite earlier works, mention previous explorers, reference lost books. Each story gestures toward others. This technique is especially prominent in The Call of Cthulhu, 1926, often mistakenly treated as the mythos origin point. The story operates as a dossier, a stack of reports, journals, and interviews stitched together by a narrator who increasingly doubts his own sanity. The monster Cthulhu is glimpsed only briefly, but its influence is everywhere, in dreams, in art, in ancient statues dredged from the sea. Importantly, The Call of Cthulhu connects its events to a global psychic disturbance, with cults and visions appearing on multiple continents simultaneously. Here we see Lovecraft shifting from isolated horror to distributed mythology. Each subsequent story reinforces this intertextual architecture. The fictional Miskatonic University in Arkham is introduced in Herbert West, Reanimator, 1922, later becoming the institutional hub of forbidden research in The Dunwich Horror and At the Mountains of Madness. Professor Armitage, who first appears in Dunwich, is cited in The Thing on the Doorstep. The Necronomicon recurs not as a plot device, but as a connective tissue, referenced across at least a dozen stories, never fully quoted, always partially glimpsed. Lovecraft's technique resembles that of real-world myth cycles, repetition with variation, fragments that refuse total synthesis. Even place names participate in this connective strategy. Arkham, Innsmouth, Dunwich, Kingsport, fictional towns in Massachusetts, are repeatedly visited, referenced, or recalled. But they are never fully mapped. Their histories contradict. Their events echo. Readers encounter them as though leafing through old, unindexed files, recognizing patterns but never resolving them. This fragmented geography evokes what Borges would later call the aesthetic of the infinite, a map whose edges blur, suggesting a larger truth just beyond grasp. We must pause to consider the deliberate incompleteness of these connections. Lovecraft never standardized his world. He often revised dates, changed names, and contradicted earlier stories. Rather than weakening the mythos, this inconsistency strengthens its realism. Real history is chaotic, full of apocrypha and dispute. Myth, too, survives not by precision, but by accumulation. Lovecraft understood this intuitively. his stories simulate historical friction. The reader is not a consumer of plot, but an archivist of suggestion. Intertextuality also enabled Lovecraft's collaborators to expand the mythos. Friends and fellow writers, most notably August Derleth, Clark Ashton Smith, and Robert E. Howard, borrowed, reimagined, and added to Lovecraft's lexicon. This cross-pollination blurred authorship and deepened the illusion of shared reality. Lovecraft encouraged it. In his letters, he refers to Yog-Sothothery not as a doctrine, but as a literary game, a way for stories to dovetail into a consistent whole. Yet what emerged was not consistency, but echo chamber recursion. Characters in one tale read about events in another. Artifacts reappear across time. The mythos behaves not like theology, but like folklore, rumored, half-remembered, reinterpreted. Importantly, none of this world-building is prioritized over atmosphere. Lovecraft is not concerned with plot logic. He is concerned with epistemic tone, the feeling that something immense, ancient, and unresolved hovers behind the text. A monster glimpsed once, a phrase repeated across stories, a location revisited under different names. All of these generate mythic density without mythic closure. In sum, Lovecraft's earliest monster appearances were not about taxonomy, but trajectory. The creatures are less important than the frameworks they unsettle. The Necronomicon is not a spellbook. It's a gravitational anchor. The cities are not settings. They're contagion zones. The intertextual references are not Easter eggs. They are structural fractures designed to simulate reality under revision. Among Lovecraft's many stories, The Dunwich Horror, 1929, stands as the clearest attempt to stage a full mythos incursion within the boundaries of a recognizable world. Where many of his tales end in ambiguity or psychological suggestion, Dunwich presents a more direct confrontation between human knowledge and alien intrusion. Yet even here, the monster is not fully visible, the conflict not fully winnable, and the epistemic toll not fully survivable. The story dramatizes key Lovecraftian concepts: interdimensional contact, hybridization, and textual contagion, while showcasing a narrative structure that appears to offer resolution but only deepens ontological instability. Set in the decaying hills of rural Massachusetts, the Dunwich Horror begins not with horror, but with genealogy. The Whateleys, a degenerate backwoods family, occupy a farmhouse on the edge of Dunwich, surrounded by folklore, suspicion, and inexplicable phenomena. Lavinia Whateley, an albino woman of diminished mental capacity, gives birth to a child, Wilbur, under highly suspicious circumstances. Wilbur matures at a grotesquely accelerated rate, seeks forbidden knowledge from Miskatonic University, and eventually dies while attempting to access the Necronomicon. His death is not the climax, but the signal. The real horror has only begun. The central revelation of the story is that Wilbur was not the only child. Lavinia bore twins, Wilbur and his invisible brother, a colossal interdimensional entity fathered by Yog-Sothoth. While Wilbur passed as human, barely, the twin remains unseen, imprisoned in the Whateley farmhouse, growing to monstrous proportions and eventually escaping. As the invisible creature rampages across the countryside, toppling trees, flattening buildings, terrifying locals, its presence is felt but never fully observed. It speaks in distorted English, emits unnatural sounds, and alters the environment around it. The effect is not cinematic terror, but ontological displacement. The land itself becomes unstable. Geometry no longer holds. We must pause here. The monster's invisibility is not simply a narrative device. It is a philosophical weapon. Lovecraft understood that the unseen is not merely scarier, it is unframeable. When characters cannot see what they're confronting, they cannot categorize, compare, or rationalize it. The horror persists as potential, infecting not just the senses, but the interpretive structure of the mind. In this way, the invisible twin functions as a spatial contagion. It warps not only the land it traverses, but the meaning of that land. The story reaches its apparent climax when professors from Miskatonic University, Armitage, Rice, and Morgan, intervene using arcane rituals and scholarly knowledge. They climb to the top of a hill and, after an intense incantation, banish the creature back to wherever it came from. It seems, on the surface, like a rare victory for reason over chaos. But this is an illusion. The professors do not understand the monster. They recognize it. They cite precedents. They recite phrases from forbidden texts. Their power is not knowledge. It is ritual repetition. They do not defeat the creature. They contain it, temporarily, by speaking its name in the correct way. What is most disturbing is what they reveal after the incantation succeeds. The entity was the offspring of Yog-Sothoth, and its rampage was an attempt to return to its father. This is not a narrative of invasion. It is a narrative of cosmic birthright. The Whateleys did not summon a god. They participated in its reproduction. The monster is not an outsider. It is family. This twist reframes the horror. The threat is not foreign contamination. It is ontological inheritance. The human bloodline has already been breached. The apocalypse, such as it is, began in a farmhouse decades ago. Consider the implications. Wilbur seeks the Necronomicon not for domination, but for alignment, to open the gates through which his brother might fully manifest. His failure triggers the uncontrolled release of that brother, but the process was already underway. Knowledge here is not liberation, it is midwifery. The books, the rituals, the chants, these are not spells, but interfaces. To read is to initiate. To translate is to participate. The university, ostensibly a stronghold of rationality, becomes a ritual site. Its library shelves are stocked not with wisdom, but with dangerous invitations. Lovecraft reinforces this inversion by casting Armitage and his colleagues not as heroic savants, but as grim custodians. They speak in evasive terms, withhold full explanations, and seem haunted by their own competence. Their success is not triumph, it is maintenance. The story ends not with peace, but with suppression. The invisible twin is gone, for now, but Yog-Sothoth remains. The texts remain, the bloodline remains, the system remains. We must also address the motif of rural decay and its role in the horror. Dunwich is portrayed as a space of regression, inbreeding, and superstition. Yet this portrayal is not simply classist caricature. It serves a larger symbolic function. The further one moves from modernity, the closer one gets to the truth. The Whateleys are not ignorant. They are proximate. Their rituals, their architecture, their alliances with ancient forces are not primitive. They are too advanced for modern minds to interpret. The horror of Dunwich is not its distance from civilization. It is its closeness to origin. In the Dunwich horror, Lovecraft demonstrates that the monstrous is not always something that arrives. Sometimes it is something that awakens, from blood, from text, from land. The story enacts the mythos not through confrontation, but through inheritance. The monster does not invade, it belongs, and it leaves behind no answers, only residue. If the Dunwich horror represents the mythos incarnate, a localized rupture that is observed, named, and briefly contained, then the call of Cthulhu, 1926, offers the mythos distributed, globalized, and diffused through consciousness itself. It is not a tale of confrontation, but of discovery, in which horror accumulates through implication. Its power lies not in action, but in structure. Told in fragmented documents and nested narratives, the story mimics the very cosmic principles it dramatizes: disorientation, recursion, and the slow erosion of human coherence. The story opens not with Cthulhu, but with a death, a familiar entry point in Gothic fiction. The narrator, Francis Wayland Thurston, inherits the notes of his recently deceased great-uncle, Professor George Gamble Angel, a renowned linguist and expert in ancient scripts. What follows is a methodical examination of artifacts, newspaper clippings, personal accounts, and dream reports. But this is no detective story. Each piece of evidence only deepens the confusion. Truth here is not revealed. It is accumulated until unbearable. At the heart of Angel's notes is a small bas-relief sculpture, an unplaceable figure bearing the hallmarks of multiple traditions but belonging to none. Alongside it are recurring dream reports from artists, poets, and sensitive individuals, all describing visions of a cyclopean city, non-Euclidean geometries, and a slumbering god. These dreams are not metaphor, they are broadcasts. The implication is clear. Cthulhu does not travel. Cthulhu resonates. It influences through thought, through conceptual contagion. This idea, dream as transmission, upends the very boundary between inner and outer. The psyche is not safe. It is a receiver. We must pause here. In The Call of Cthulhu, Lovecraft executes one of his most profound inversions. Horror is not something that happens to people. It is something that re-emerges from within them. The artists do not encounter Cthulhu. They remember it. The cultists do not worship a new god. They have preserved fragments of a pre-human knowledge. Cthulhu is not novel. It is residual, the sediment of a cosmic history that continues to echo in the nervous system of the planet. The narrative then shifts to a second nested account. Inspector. Legrassi's 1908 raid on a cult in the swamps of Louisiana. There, police discover a ritual being conducted around a stone idol matching the sculpture in Angel's possession. The participants, drawn from multiple ethnic backgrounds and speaking in tongues unknown to one another, chant phrases like Fanglui Mangluinaf, Cthulhu Rillier Wagahnagul Ftagn. Translation: In his house at Rillier, dead Cthulhu waits dreaming. This chant recurs throughout the story, not as language, but as incantatory pattern, a reminder that what is forgotten is not lost, merely dormant. Crucially, the story offers no master key, no final revelation. Each testimony, Angel's notes, the sculptor's dreams, the police report, adds partial understanding. The reader assembles the shape of Cthulhu's mythos not through direct vision, but through triangulation. This mimics real-world myth-making, where traditions evolve through oral repetition, contradiction, and drift. Cthulhu, like the gods of ancient cultures, is not known directly. It is known through recurrence. The climax arrives in the final layer of narration, the journal of a Norwegian sailor, Gustaf Johansen, whose ship, the Emma, stumbles upon the risen city of R'lyeh after an earthquake disturbs the Pacific seafloor. Here, for the first time, the story brushes against direct encounter. The sailors glimpse R'lyeh's alien architecture and are attacked by the newly awakened Cthulhu. The descriptions are fragmentary. Great door opened, flabby claws, greenish bulk. But the emphasis remains not on terror, but on topology. R'lyeh's geometries are wrong, Its angles induce nausea. Its physical rules break expectation. This is the moment Lovecraft completes his metaphor. The monster is spatial logic made hostile. Johansen and one crewmate managed to flee, ramming their boat into Cthulhu's form and watching it collapse and reform like vapor. This moment is key. The monster is not corporeal in any consistent way. It is plastic, not biologically, but ontologically, shifting between dimensions, responding to proximity not as a physical entity, but as a conceptual waveform. It is less a body than an event. Back in the framing narrative, Thurston concludes his investigation with unease. Cthulhu has returned to slumber, the city submerged once more. The cult remains. The dreams may come again, but the story ends not with closure, but with a warning. I shall never sleep calmly again when I think of the horrors that lurk ceaselessly behind life. The terror is not the god. It is the possibility of recurrence. This narrative structure, documentary fragmentation, epistemic layering, partial encounters, became the template for much of what followed. What distinguishes Cthulhu from typical monster fiction is its refusal to isolate the monster. The horror is not confined to Arlia or to one cult or one event. It is diffused across space, mind, and culture. The Dia, monster lives in dreams, in text, in instinct. The story is not about the awakening of Cthulhu. It is about the awakening of awareness. What Lovecraft achieves here is not myth, but meta-myth, a structure designed to simulate the discovery of forgotten myth while never permitting its full recovery. The reader becomes complicit in the excavation. By the end, one is not sure what has been learned, only that something vast has shifted and that it may never fully retreat. Lovecraft's original vision was intentionally diffuse. His entities whispered through dreams, fractured space, and infected texts, not as gods with roles, but as conceptual intrusions. Yet after his death in 1937, a cohort of devoted collaborators and literary descendants sought to preserve and expand what they came to call the Cthulhu Mythos. The result was a vast intergenerational project that transformed Lovecraft's anti-system into something resembling a mythological system, a shift that secured the mythos's cultural longevity, but also introduced tensions between implication and categorization, ambiguity and lore. Foremost among these inheritors was August Derleth, Lovecraft's correspondent and eventual literary executor. In founding Arkham House in 1939 to preserve and publish Lovecraft's work, Derleth ensured the mythos would not dissolve into obscurity. But Derleth did more than publish. He reorganized. Lovecraft's entities, which operated as principles of disruption, were recast as gods within a dualistic theology. Derleth framed them into a binary: elder gods, benevolent or neutral forces of cosmic order, versus great old ones, malevolent, chaotic entities seeking destruction. Yog-Sothoth and Nodens became allies of humanity. Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep became enemies to be thwarted. This reclassification, while narratively convenient, betrayed Lovecraft's metaphysical foundation. In Lovecraft's original framework, there is no good or evil, only scale. Cthulhu is not a villain. Azathoth is not a tyrant. They are conditions of reality, not agents with goals. Derleth's moral overlay introduced coherence where Lovecraft had insisted on collapse. In doing so, he transformed epistemic horror into cosmic fantasy. The unknowable became taxonomized. We must pause here. Derleth's reinterpretation was not heresy, it was translation. It made Lovecraft's world more accessible to readers steeped in Western narrative traditions. The introduction of elements, earth, air, fire, water, as categorical tools, echoed familiar magical systems. Yog-Sothoth was aligned with time and space, Cthulhu with water, Hastur with air, and so on. This allowed new writers to enter the mythos with clearer rules, but that clarity came at a cost. Where Lovecraft created entities that functioned as epistemic viruses, Derleth turned them into recognizable villains. The horror was no longer conceptual, it was strategic. Despite this shift, Derleth's stewardship enabled a proliferation of stories. Writers like Robert Bloch, Clark Ashton Smith, and Henry Kuttner contributed their own creations to the mythos: De Vermis Mysteriis, Zoth Almog, the Book of Ibon. These additions did not always follow Derleth's theological structure, and often gestured back toward Lovecraft's dreamlike ambiguity. Smith, in particular, merged decadent prose with alien ecologies, crafting entities like Sathogwa, a toad-like dormant deity that radiates inertia rather than malevolence. Smith's contributions kept the mythos messy, a necessary countercurrent to Derleth's codification. Later writers pushed this expansion further, drawing the mythos into new genres and media. Brian Lumley's Titus Crow series in the 1970s reimagined mythos horror as cosmic adventure, with protagonists actively opposing Cthulhu's spawn using arcane technology and psychic warfare. Lumley embraced Derleth's cosmology, complete with elder god alliances and heroic resistance. In doing so, he offered readers catharsis and closure, precisely what Lovecraft had resisted. The universe became a battlefield, not a conceptual minefield. Yet not all expansions diluted the horror. Thomas Ligotti, emerging in the 1990s, rejected Derleth's structure and instead resurrected Lovecraft's original tone: bleak, anti-narrative, and deeply philosophical. In stories like The Last Feast of Harlequin and The Shadow at the Bottom of the World, Ligotti replaces external monsters with internal decay. His horror is not about gods in space, but the hollowness of consciousness itself. Ligotti's protagonists don't battle entities. They unravel under the weight of awareness. Here, Lovecraft's legacy becomes not mythic, but ontological. Similarly, Caitlin R. Kiernan reintroduced ambiguity and psychological fracture. Her work blends Lovecraftian motifs with trauma, gender, and memory, crafting stories where the horror often lies not in the ancient being but in the aftershock of contact. The mythos is not a canon to Kiernan. It is a disrupted archive, constantly erasing itself as it is read. This return to instability marks a critical revision of Lovecraft's legacy, honoring his structural disorientation without replicating his personal prejudices. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game, 1981, by Chaosium, brought another key evolution. It formalized Lovecraftian horror into a system of stats, sanity points, and narrative loops. Investigators could now mechanically experience the spiral into madness. Ironically, by turning dread into dice rolls, the game preserved the sense of inevitable decay. No matter how well you played, the deeper you went, the worse it became. Sanity eroded, truth dissolved. Players were rewarded not for defeating monsters, but for surviving contact with meaning. We must also acknowledge the Internet's role in mythos expansion. Collaborative spaces like the SCP Foundation, r/No Sleep, and Independent horror fiction forums have continued Lovecraft's model of distributed myth-making. Stories reference one another obliquely, link through artifacts and keywords, and simulate archival layering. This participatory storytelling resurrects Lovecraft's technique of incomplete convergence, even as it shifts tone, content, and ideology. The mythos is no longer authored, it is inherited collectively. Yet despite this diversity, a tension remains. Every attempt to clarify Lovecraft's creations risks domesticating them. The more an entity is defined, categorized, or granted motive, the less it can serve its original function: to break the human mind's capacity to organize reality. The mythos survives not through coherence, but through echo. And the best expansions are those that resist resolution, stories that leave more open than they close. In sum, collaborative expansion of the Lovecraftian cosmos has ensured its cultural endurance. From Derleth's taxonomies to Ligotti's philosophical voids, from RPG stat sheets to digital myth-making, the mythos has been everything from battlefield to literary virus. But the original infection, Lovecraft's vision of horror as structural truth, persists only where the monstrous remains undefined, where it is still possible for knowledge to be contact, not comprehension. As the Cthulhu mythos diffused beyond literature, it did not remain confined to fiction. Instead, its logic, fragmentation, recursion, epistemic rupture began appearing in unexpected places: paranormal folklore, urban legends, real sightings, and conspiracy hoaxes. The monsters themselves remained fictional, but the conditions they generated, doubt, unease, the collapse of interpretive authority, became culturally real. We do not live in a Lovecraftian world because Cthulhu sleeps beneath the ocean, but because meaning behaves the way he imagined: slippery, recursive, and prone to mutation. In the early decades following Lovecraft's death, fringe occultists and conspiracy theorists began treating the mythos as something more than fiction. While this was partly due to deliberate play, it also stemmed from Lovecraft's own techniques. Invented books like the Necronomicon, citations of non-existent sources, and scholarly-style footnotes gave his stories the tone of documentation. Readers unfamiliar with the boundaries of fiction could, and did, misread these as suppressed truths. The most famous artifact of this misreading is the Simon Necronomicon, published in 1977 by a group of New York occultists. Purporting to be a real translation of Lovecraft's forbidden tome, the Simon Necronomicon blended Sumerian mythology, medieval demonology, and invented rituals under a fictional veneer. It was sold in metaphysical bookstores, treated by some as a genuine grimoire, and sparked decades of occult commentary. Even after its creators admitted the hoax, its legacy remained. Why? Because the hoax was not experienced as deception. It was experienced as participation in a deeper aesthetic truth. We must pause here. The Simon Necronomicon does not survive because of its authenticity. It survives because it embodies the same qualities as Lovecraft's mythos: ambiguity, recursion, and the sense that knowledge is already contaminated. To touch the book, even playfully, is to become complicit in something unresolved. This blending of fiction and folklore accelerates in the 20th and 21st centuries, particularly through events like the Philadelphia experiment, allegedly in 1943, in which the U.S. Navy supposedly rendered a ship invisible and accidentally teleported it through space-time. Though universally dismissed by historians, the story spread through pulp magazines and UFO subcultures. Its central themes, unseen dimensions, technological madness, memory distortion, mirror Lovecraftian tropes, despite no direct influence. It is not that the mythos caused these hoaxes. It is that Lovecraft anticipated the grammar of myth in the age of paranoia. The Montauk Project, a later elaboration of Philadelphia lore, introduced mind control, time travel, and alien contact, all buried beneath layers of disinformation and overlapping testimonies. Its spiraling structure, where each new fact undermines the previous one, enacts what we might call the Lovecraftian feedback loop. More data results in less clarity. This, too, is how the mythos functions. The closer one comes to understanding, the less stable the universe becomes. Even pure fiction has spawned real-world psychological phenomena. Consider The Backrooms, an internet-born horror mythos in which characters no-clip out of reality and enter endless, liminal office spaces. The Backrooms are not Lovecraftian in aesthetic, but they are purely Lovecraftian in structure. There is no villain, no climax, only architecture that defeats interpretation, a non-space that stretches infinitely and deteriorates one's sense of self. The horror here is not violence. It is placement without reference. This is relief in fluorescent lighting. One of the most fascinating examples of reality blurring into myth is the case of The Man from Taured, an urban legend rooted in a supposed 1950s incident. A man arrives at a Tokyo airport carrying a passport from a country that does not exist, Taured. He is detained, only to disappear mysteriously from his locked hotel room. Though no verified source exists for this story, it has endured for decades, precisely because of its Lovecraftian structure. Time displacement, collapsed identity, administrative confusion, and the refusal of reality to remain anchored. In short, they are cultural echoes of mythos logic, even when the monsters are absent. These phenomena behave like Cthulhu, not in form but in function. They do not attack. They arrive. They spread. They suggest that reality itself has seams. This cultural haunting extends into performance. People have reported sightings of Cthulhu-shaped shadows in deep-sea scans, misidentified cephalopods, or strange lights off the coast of New Zealand, mistakenly attributed to sunken relief. Of course, none of these are verifiable. But verification is beside the point. The structure of the mythos has made it plausible that a fictional city could be discovered accidentally. That is Lovecraft's final trick. He did not create monsters. He created the conditions under which monsters feel inevitable. Myths, hoaxes, real sightings, all arise not from evidence, but from the psychological space he prepared. A world where the more you know, the less secure you become. Lovecraft's influence on modern media is vast, yet his work remains notoriously resistant to adaptation. This resistance is not accidental. Lovecraftian horror is not visual at its core. It is structural. It operates through absence, implication, and epistemic unease rather than spectacle. Film, games, and music that succeed in adapting Lovecraft do so not by showing the monster, but by reproducing the conditions under which the monster destabilizes perception. Most failures occur when creators mistake the mythos for aesthetics rather than philosophy. Cinema provides the clearest illustration of this tension. Direct adaptations of Lovecraft's stories often falter because the medium demands visualization. To show Cthulhu clearly is to diminish him. The moment the monster is fully rendered, it becomes an object, bounded, finite, consumable. Lovecraft's horror collapses under that pressure. This is why films like The Call of Cthulhu, 2005, which adopt silent-era techniques and stylized abstraction, are more effective than higher-budget literalizations. By embracing distortion, shadows, and restraint, such films preserve uncertainty rather than eliminate it. More successful are films influenced by Lovecraft, rather than adapted from him. The Mist, 2007, for example, presents creatures from another dimension but focuses its horror on epistemic breakdown, panic, misinterpretation, and the collapse of social order. The monsters matter less than the realization that no explanatory framework holds. Similarly, The Void, 2016, avoids detailed cosmology and instead traps its characters in a hospital that becomes a liminal space, part cult site, part interdimensional threshold. The film's power lies in its refusal to explain what is happening. Knowledge is withheld, and that withholding becomes the source of dread. Event Horizon, 1997, offers a particularly instructive case. Often described as Lovecraftian science fiction, the film reframes cosmic horror through technological transgression. A spaceship returns from a failed faster-than-light experiment carrying something unspeakable. What matters is not what the crew finds, but what the ship did. Space itself becomes hostile, not because of aliens, but because human curiosity violated boundaries it could not comprehend. This aligns closely with Lovecraft's core logic. Horror emerges not from invasion, but from contact. Video games, by contrast, are uniquely suited to Lovecraftian adaptation, precisely because they allow for slow erosion rather than sudden revelation. The Call of Cthulhu role-playing game established a crucial mechanic: sanity loss. Progress does not empower the player, it destabilizes them. Each clue gathered, each truth uncovered, reduces the character's ability to function. This is Lovecraft's epistemology translated into systems design. Modern games build on this foundation. Bloodborne, 2015, begins as gothic horror and gradually reveals itself as cosmic horror. The player's growing insight literally changes what they can perceive. New enemies appear only after thresholds of knowledge are crossed. This is not cosmetic. It is philosophical. Understanding reshapes reality, and not for the better. Control, 2019, employs bureaucratic surrealism to similar effect. Its enemies are not gods, but anomalous objects, redacted reports, and unstable architectures. The player navigates a government agency whose documents undermine the reality they attempt to catalog. The horror lies in administration itself, a deeply Lovecraftian inversion. Games like The Shore and Darkest Dungeon further emphasize atmosphere over mastery. Progress feels fragile. Victory feels temporary. The world resists being solved. This is crucial. Lovecraftian games succeed when they deny the player power fantasy and replace it with epistemic vulnerability. Music, perhaps unexpectedly, has proven one of the most effective carriers of Lovecraftian horror. This is because music operates without explicit representation. It can evoke scale, dread, and alienness without naming them. In extreme metal, bands such as Portal, Sulfur Aeon, and Ulcerate use dissonance, repetition, and non-traditional song structures to simulate cognitive overload. Lyrics are often fragmented or obscured, functioning more as texture than narrative. Meaning is present, but inaccessible. Dark ambient and drone music push this further. Artists working in these genres strip away rhythm and melody, leaving long, oppressive soundscapes that feel less composed than unearthed. Listening becomes endurance rather than pleasure. This mirrors Lovecraft's narrative effect. The audience is not entertained so much as exposed. The music does not progress. It persists. Time feels distorted. Resolution never arrives. We must pause here to recognize a pattern. Across all media, successful Lovecraftian adaptation depends on withholding. The monster must remain partially unseen. The explanation must remain incomplete. The audience must feel that something essential has been missed. When adaptations explain too much, when lore becomes encyclopedic, the horror evaporates. Lovecraft's legacy in film, games, and music is therefore paradoxical. He is everywhere, yet rarely present in full. His influence survives not through faithful reproduction, but through structural mimicry. The most Lovecraftian works are those that fail to translate him directly, choosing instead to recreate the experience of encountering something that should not be fully understood. In the final analysis, Lovecraft's monsters were never meant to be seen clearly, played efficiently, or scored triumphantly. They were meant to linger at the edge of comprehension. Any adaptation that remembers this, any medium that preserves ambiguity as its primary weapon, keeps the mythos alive. Lovecraft's afterlife is not confined to fandom. It unfolds in two overlapping arenas that rarely coexist comfortably: academic theory and subcultural practice. In both, the mythos is treated less as a body of stories than as a method, a way of thinking about uncertainty, power, and the limits of meaning. What scholars analyze and what subcultures perform are, at their core, responses to the same provocation, the suggestion that human frameworks are provisional, fragile, and possibly irrelevant. In academic contexts, Lovecraft has increasingly been approached not as a pulp writer, but as a theorist of epistemic instability. Beginning in the late 20th century, literary critics and philosophers re-evaluated his work through lenses unavailable in his own time. Post-structuralism, particularly after the rise of Derrida and Foucault in the 1960s and 1970s, offered a vocabulary for what Lovecraft dramatized intuitively. Language does not transparently represent reality. Knowledge is not neutral. Power circulates through discourse. Lovecraft's monsters, in this reading, are not creatures, but failures of signification, points where language collapses under conceptual strain. This shift allowed scholars to situate Lovecraft alongside writers he never anticipated being compared to. Thomas Ligotti has explicitly framed Lovecraft as a metaphysical pessimist in the tradition of Schopenhauer. Mark Fisher, writing in the early 20th century, linked Lovecraftian dread to capitalist realism and the anxiety of systems too large to comprehend. In these analyses, Cthulhu is no longer a tentacled god, but a metaphor for totalizing systems, bureaucracy, markets, networks, that operate without empathy or oversight. The horror is structural, not supernatural. At the same time, Lovecraft has been appropriated as a tool of intellectual rebellion. His work is often invoked in opposition to comforting narratives, religious teleology, nationalist myth, technological utopianism. To cite Lovecraft in scholarly discourse is to gesture toward a universe that does not promise redemption. This is not nihilism for its own sake. It is a refusal of premature closure. Lovecraft's enduring appeal in philosophy and cultural theory lies in his insistence that some questions destroy the frameworks that ask them. Parallel to this academic uptake, subcultural communities have embraced Lovecraft in ways that are participatory, performative, and deliberately unstable. Occult subcultures, particularly those aligned with chaos magic and Discordianism, have treated the mythos as a symbolic toolkit rather than a belief system. In these spaces, Cthulhu and Nyarlathotep are not worshipped. They are invoked ironically, used as conceptual lenses for exploring identity, power, and narrative collapse. The mythos becomes a sandbox for testing how belief functions when sincerity is optional. We must pause here. This is not simple fandom. These subcultures understand, often implicitly, that Lovecraftian horror operates best when it is incomplete. Rituals are half serious. Texts are deliberately contradictory. Authority is mocked, even as it is simulated. This mirrors Lovecraft's own narrative strategy, constructing the appearance of ancient truth while undermining its coherence. The result is a form of cultural play that feels dangerous not because it claims truth, but because it refuses to settle. Nowhere is this more evident than in collaborative myth-making communities. The SCP Foundation, which emerged in the mid-2000s, is often described as Lovecraftian, but this label obscures its deeper significance. SCP is not merely inspired by Lovecraft, it operationalizes his method. Entries are written as bureaucratic documents, full of redactions, contradictions, and shifting classifications. No single author controls the canon. Knowledge is provisional. The more one reads, the less stable the universe becomes. This is Lovecraft's epistemology translated into digital culture. Similarly, internet horror communities such as creepypasta forums and analog horror projects adopt Lovecraftian structures without replicating his imagery. The monsters are often unseen. The threat emerges through corrupted media, unreliable narration, and recursive documentation. These stories are not consumed passively. They are assembled by the audience. Interpretation becomes participation. This is crucial. Lovecraft's greatest innovation was not the monster. It was the reader's role as unwilling archivist. Academic discourse has not been immune to this participatory impulse. Conferences, journals, and edited volumes now regularly engage with Lovecraft not only as an object of study, but as a provocation. Scholars debate whether his racism can be separated from his metaphysics, whether the mythos can be reclaimed or must be dismantled. Some argue for abolition, discarding Lovecraft entirely. Others argue for transformation, rewriting the mythos from marginalized perspectives. Both positions treat the mythos not as static canon, but as contested territory. This contestation itself is Lovecraftian. There is no final interpretation, no authoritative reading. Each attempt to resolve the tension generates further instability. The mythos resists ownership. It behaves like a distributed system, adapting to new cultural pressures while retaining its core function, undermining certainty. In both scholarly and subcultural spaces, Lovecraft's work functions as a boundary object, a shared reference point that means different things to different communities without ever stabilizing into consensus. This instability is not a flaw. It is the engine of endurance. The mythos survives because it refuses closure, because it can be read as cosmic theology, philosophical parable, cultural critique, or narrative virus, depending on who encounters it. Lovecraft's most unsettling legacy is not literary, it is psychological. Long after the tentacles, cities, and forbidden books fade from memory, what remains is a subtle but persistent shift in how reality is felt. Lovecraftian horror endures because it articulates a condition many modern individuals already inhabit, a world where explanatory systems proliferate, yet meaning feels increasingly unstable. The monsters are gone, the implications remain. At its core, Lovecraft's philosophy confronts the reader with a reversal of the sublime. In earlier, aesthetic traditions, the sublime, whether in Kant or Burke, produced awe that ultimately reaffirmed human dignity. One stood before vastness and survived, enriched. Lovecraft offers something colder, awe without affirmation, vastness without return. His universe inspires wonder, but that wonder does not elevate. It displaces. The reader does not leave feeling small but reassured. they leave feeling unmoored. This is the psychological signature of cosmic horror. This effect aligns closely with modern anxieties about scale. Nuclear weapons, climate systems, global finance, artificial intelligence. These are forces that exceed individual agency while remaining human-made. Lovecraft anticipated this psychic tension. His monsters function as metaphors not for fear of death, but for fear of irrelevance. The realization that one's actions, values, and narratives may have no meaningful impact on the systems governing existence is profoundly destabilizing. Lovecraft did not invent this fear. He gave it form. We must pause here. The enduring power of Lovecraftian thought lies not in despair, but in exposure. It removes the comfort of anthropocentrism and leaves the reader facing a question they cannot resolve. If the universe does not care, what grounds meaning? Lovecraft does not answer. He refuses. This refusal forces the reader into a philosophical vacuum where inherited assumptions no longer function. Some retreat, others reinterpret. A few adapt. None emerge unchanged. Psychologically, this produces a distinctive kind of unease. Not panic, not terror, but background dread, a low-frequency hum beneath everyday thought. Many readers report that Lovecraft's stories linger not as images, but as ideas. The fear surfaces later, uninvited, when contemplating deep time, astronomical distances, or the fragility of perception. This delayed effect is intentional. Lovecraft's horror operates retrospectively. It activates after comprehension, not during spectacle. There is also a paradoxical attraction at work. Cosmic horror offers a form of intellectual honesty. In a culture saturated with reassurance, self-help narratives, technological optimism, moral certainty, Lovecraft provides a counterweight. His work suggests that it is permissible to acknowledge uncertainty without resolving it. That meaning may be constructed, provisional, or absent altogether. For some, this is not depressing, but liberating. If there is no cosmic script, then human values must be authored locally without divine validation. Philosophically, this places Lovecraft in uneasy proximity to existentialism, though he diverges in crucial ways. Where Camus argued for rebellion in the face of absurdity, Lovecraft offers no such prescription. His characters rarely choose defiance. They collapse, withdraw, or disappear. This is not a failure of imagination. It is a statement. The universe does not notice rebellion. The most radical act is not resistance, but recognition. Not courage, but clarity. This brings us to the final implication, the one that lingers longest and explains the title's promise of something banned. Lovecraft's most dangerous monster is not Cthulhu, Azathoth, or Yog-Sothoth. It is the idea that thought itself may be maladaptive, that the human mind evolved to survive, not to comprehend reality at scale, that certain truths, if fully internalized, would dismantle the psychological structures necessary for daily life. This is why madness functions not as punishment, but as adaptation. A mind that breaks may be protecting itself. In this sense, the final horror is not external. It is cognitive. The suspicion that curiosity has limits, that there are questions we are not meant to ask, not because of morality, but because of architecture. The brain cannot carry infinite weight. Lovecraft's work implies that sanity is not a given. It is a negotiated truce between perception and necessity. And yet, we continue to return to the stories, to the ideas, to the unease. This persistence suggests something equally important, that even in a universe without guarantees, humans seek orientation. We read Lovecraft not to find answers, but to map the edges of the unanswerable, to know where certainty fails, to glimpse the abyss and return, not unchanged, but awake. Lovecraft never offers closure. He leaves us with implication, not instruction. The monsters sleep. The books remain closed. The dreams may return. What endures is not fear, but a quiet recalibration of perspective. A recognition that meaning, if it exists at all, must be constructed in spite of the cosmos, not because of it. And perhaps that is why his horror persists. Not because it tells us what to believe, but because it asks whether belief itself is enough.